A single mother-to-be was delivering meals when a millionaire customer began leaving secret notes with the orders. When she discovered who he was, their lives changed forever. A story of love and overcoming that will touch your heart. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like and comment where you are watching from. The alarm clock rang at 4 in the morning, cutting through the thick silence of the studio apartment in Brooklyn like a cold blade. Isabella Smith opened her eyes slowly, feeling the familiar weight of exhaustion that had become part of her routine. Her 7-month baby bump stood out beneath the thin sheet, and it took her 3 attempts to get out of the narrow bed that occupied almost the entire 15-square-meter room. "Just another day, my baby," she whispered to herself, gently rubbing her belly. "Just another day to show that we can do this." The musty smell of the apartment mixed with the persistent aroma of spices that clung to the peeling walls. Isabella walked over to the small 2-burner stove, her bare feet freezing on the cracked ceramic floor. The makeshift kitchen occupied a corner of the space, with pots stacked on a wooden shelf. She had assembled herself and a small refrigerator that constantly hummed, threatening to stop at any moment. As she lit the fire under the pots she had prepared the night before, Isabella gazed through the tiny window at the landscape she knew by heart. Brick buildings stretching as far as the eye could see, satellite dishes dotting the rooftops like metallic flowers, and the first lights flickering on in the neighbors' windows, who were also starting their early survival journeys. "Good morning, New York," she murmured, adjusting the flame under the pot of beans she had soaked since the night before. The routine was timed like a military operation. 4:15, check the seasoning of the beans and add the fresh bay leaves she bought at the corner market. 4:30, start preparing the rice, always cooked to perfection, fluffy just like her grandmother Benedita had taught her in childhood in Charleston. 5 o'clock. Separate the portions of meat she had seasoned and marinated overnight, each piece cut precisely to yield exactly the necessary amount. The phone vibrated on the plastic table that served as her countertop. A message from Mr. Thompson, the doorman of the commercial building on Wall Street. "Isabella, the folks on the 23rd floor are already asking what time you'll arrive today. That Dr. Edward asked me to let you know he wants 2 meals today." Isabella smiled for the first time that day. Edward Smith had become her most loyal customer in just a month of deliveries. Always punctual, always polite, always leaving a generous tip that made a real difference in her tight budget. But there was something more about him that piqued her curiosity, a silent sadness she recognized in his tired eyes, the same one she saw in the mirror every morning. 2 meals, she thought aloud, stirring the beans with a worn wooden spoon. Must be an important meeting today. At 5:40, Isabella put on the jeans that barely fit anymore, and the loose shirt that concealed her prominent belly. The helmet borrowed from Mrs. Johnson, her neighbor from upstairs, rested on the only chair in the apartment. The motorcycle, a 2010 Honda Rebel with over 200,000 miles on it, awaited her in the makeshift parking lot of the building. "Johnson, are you sure you don't need the bike today?" she asked, knocking on her neighbor's door. "Godspeed, my dear," replied Mrs. Johnson, a 68-year-old woman from Florida who had become her only confidant since moving to New York. "That baby is going to be an entrepreneur, you'll see, already helping Mum work." The journey to Wall Street took 50 minutes in the morning traffic of New York. Isabella knew every speed bump, every traffic light, every street where she could gain a few precious seconds. The thermal backpack on her back weighed 15 pounds when full, but she had developed a technique to distribute the weight that didn't strain her already overloaded back from pregnancy. As she navigated between the stopped cars in the traffic on the East River, Isabella thought about the sequence of events that had led her here. 8 years in the textile factory, waking up at 5 in the morning to arrive punctually at 6. 8 years dreaming of a different life, saving every penny to open her own business someday. And then, like a bolt from the blue, the mass layoffs that hit 200 employees on some random Tuesday in March. The company is going through a restructuring, the manager had said, a 40-year-old man who avoided looking into the eyes of the laid-off employees. You were chosen based on technical and productivity criteria. Technical criteria. Isabella almost laughed at the irony. She had been one of the most productive workers in the department, knowing each machine like it was an extension of her own body. But she was pregnant, and that weighed more on the company's cost sheets than 8 years of dedication. The first sign that she had arrived at the business district were the skyscrapers rising like giants of glass and concrete against the still, dark sky. Wall Street woke up differently than Brooklyn. Here, the lights were brighter, the cars newer, and people walked with a different urgency, carrying leather briefcases and phones that cost more than her apartment rent. Isabella parked the motorcycle in front of the corporate tower, a 30-story building with a mirrored facade reflecting the first lights of dawn. Mr. Thompson was already waiting for her at the entrance with his usual warm smile. "Good morning, Isabella. How's the little one?" he asked, pointing at her belly. "Giving me trouble just like her mother," she replied, returning the smile. "Has Edward come down yet?" "Not yet, but he arrived early. Today. I saw the light on in the office since 5:30. Doesn't this man have a family?" Isabella nodded thoughtfully as she organized the meal containers in the smaller thermal bag she used for internal deliveries. 23 floors in the elevator, a marble corridor echoing her footsteps, glass doors with golden plaques indicating companies whose names she could barely pronounce. Eduardo's office was at the end of the corridor, in a spacious room with a view of the entire city. Through the glass door, she could see him leaning over the desk, typing intensely on the computer, his slightly disheveled grey hair and loosened tie despite the early hour. Isabella gently knocked on the door. Eduardo looked up, and for a moment she saw something she couldn't identify pass across his expression. Relief, perhaps, or an overwhelming gratitude for a simple food delivery. "Good morning, Mr. Eduardo," she said, entering the room. "2 complete stews, as you requested." "Good morning, Isabella," he replied, and there was something different in his voice today. "Actually, I need to make a special request." Eduardo stood up from the leather chair, and Isabella noticed he seemed taller than she remembered. Maybe it was the bright office light, or the fact that she was seeing him standing for the first time. He was about 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders that slightly hunched forward, as if carrying an invisible weight. His dark brown eyes had deep bags under them, and the hands he always kept busy shuffling papers or typing trembled almost imperceptibly. "The special request, Mr. Eduardo?" Isabella asked, placing the thermal bag on the conference table that occupied a corner of the room. "Yes, it's, well," he hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "Today I have a video conference with German investors at 2 in the afternoon. They will have lunch here in the office, and I wanted them to try authentic Brazilian food." Isabella opened the meal containers, releasing the familiar aroma of stew seasoned with garlic, onion, and bay leaves. Eduardo closed his eyes for a moment, as if he were absorbing not just the smell, but some distant memory. "How much do you need?" she asked, already mentally calculating the necessary ingredients and preparation time. "It would be for 8 people. But that's not all." Eduardo walked to the window, contemplating the city that was beginning to wake down below. "My grandfather always said that good food carries history, that when you eat something made with care, you're eating a piece of the soul of the person who cooked it." The words took Isabella by surprise. In a month of deliveries, their conversations had been limited to polite greetings and practical details about the orders. She had never seen this more introspective side of the executive, who always seemed so controlled and distant. "Did your grandfather cook?" she asked, curious. "No, but my grandmother Grace did. She made a stew." Eduardo paused mid-sentence, as if realizing he was sharing more than he intended. "Sorry, I didn't mean to take your time with old stories." "It's no problem," Isabella said softly. "My grandmother Beatrice also cooked. She used to say that seasoning without a story is like a hug without warmth. It might fill your stomach, but it doesn't warm your heart." Eduardo turned to her, and for the first time since she had started the deliveries, Isabella saw a genuine smile cross his face. It wasn't the polite and formal smile he always wore, but something deeper, almost vulnerable. "Exactly," he murmured. "That's exactly it." Isabella felt a strange pang in her chest. It wasn't physical, although pregnancy brought constant discomfort. It was something more complex, a mix of recognition and caution. It had been a long time since she had met someone who understood the real meaning of comfort food, the emotional weight that each carefully prepared dish carried. "For 8 people I can make the complete stew with all the traditional sides," she said, returning to the practical aspect of the conversation. "Rice, sautéed greens, bacon bits, crispy pork, sliced oranges, and I can make a dessert, flan or coconut custard." "Perfect." Eduardo took out his wallet, but hesitated. "Before opening it, can I ask you something? How did you learn to cook like that?" The question was simple, but Isabella felt there were deeper layers behind it. Eduardo wasn't just making small talk. There was a genuine curiosity in his voice, an interest that went beyond the business relationship. "Out of necessity," she replied honestly. "My mother worked in 2 households, leaving early in the morning and coming back at night. I learned to cook so I wouldn't starve." "And where was that?" "Charleston, rural South Carolina. My grandmother lived on the same street, so I spent my afternoons at her house. She taught me the secrets of seasoning, the stories behind each recipe." Eduardo nodded thoughtfully. "My grandfather had a farm in Pleasant Valley, southern Minas. I spent a few summers there when I was a kid. The kitchen on the farm was the heart of the house. Wood stove, cast iron pots. There was always someone preparing something." "And now you don't cook anymore?" Isabella asked, looking around the impeccably organized office. Eduardo laughed without humor. "I have a kitchen that looks like it came out of a decor magazine, and I don't even use the microwave. My diet consists basically of expensive deliveries and business dinners." "That's not living," Isabella commented without thinking, and immediately regretted her familiarity. "Sorry, I didn't mean to be intrusive." "No, you're right," Eduardo said, surprising her. "It's not living. It's survival disguised as success." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, but laden with mutual understanding. Isabella realized that, despite the glaring differences in their financial situations, she and Eduardo shared something fundamental: the loneliness of those who have built a life based entirely on work. "Well," she finally said, "I'll need a few hours to prepare everything. What time do you need it ready?" 1:30 would be good. And Isabella, thank you, not just for the food, but for," he gestured vaguely, "for reminding me of some important things." When Isabella went downstairs to grab the motorcycle, she found an envelope discreetly placed inside the thermal bag. Her name was written in elegant, careful handwriting on the outside. Inside, besides the usual payment for the 2 meals, there was a handwritten note. "Isabella, I don't know if it's appropriate to write this, but I need to say your meals are the best part of my days. Not just because of the quality of the food, but because of the care I can feel in each dish. In an increasingly automated and impersonal world, you remind me that there are still people who do things with love. Thank you for that. Edward." Below the note, There was enough cash to cover not only the special lunch for 8 people, but also a considerable extra amount, more than she earned in an entire week of deliveries. Isabella reread the note 3 times, sitting on the motorcycle parked in front of the building. There was something in the vulnerable honesty of those words that touched defenses she had carefully built over the years. Since the disappointment with the baby's father, a relationship that had ended as soon as she told him about the pregnancy, Isabella had promised herself not to depend emotionally on anyone. But that note didn't seem like an attempt at seduction or manipulation. It felt like a genuine acknowledgement between 2 lonely people who had unexpectedly found a small, safe harbor in each other's presence. "Be careful, Isabella," she murmured to herself, tucking the note into her wallet. "Rich man and poor woman never worked out anywhere." Still, as she drove back home to prepare the special lunch, she couldn't stop smiling. Back in her studio apartment, Isabella spread the ingredients on the plastic table like a general preparing for battle. Black beans, smoked sausage, pork ribs, bacon, dried beef. Each item had been chosen with surgical precision at the municipal market, where she knew the best suppliers and exactly which cuts would give the most authentic flavor. 8 important people, she murmured, turning on all the burners. I can't disappoint. By 9 in the morning, the beans were already bubbling in the pressure cooker as she sautéed the spices in a larger skillet she had bought specifically for special orders like this. Diced onions, finely chopped garlic, bay leaves she had picked one by one, and diced bacon, releasing golden, aromatic fat. The phone rang. It was Mrs. Johnson. "Isa, my dear, what is that smell rising? It seems like you're cooking for the Pope." Isabella laughed, wiping the sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. "It's a special order, Rosa, an important lunch." "That Dr. Edward again?" The question made Isabella hesitate. In recent days she had mentioned Edward a few times in her conversations with the neighbor, always in the context of business, but perhaps with more details than she shared about other clients. "Yes, he's hosting some German investors." Rosa made that sound experienced women make when they notice things that younger ones haven't caught on to yet. "Germans like hearty seasoned food. Make the bacon bits nice and dry. They'll love that." By 10:30, the sausage was golden and the ribs tender, falling apart at the fork. Isabella tasted the bean broth and closed her eyes, momentarily transported back to her grandmother Beatrice's kitchen. It was exactly the right flavor, not too salty, with the smokiness of the meat harmonizing beautifully with the creaminess of the beans. "It's good, Grandma," she whispered to the air, a habit she had kept since her grandmother's passing 5 years ago. The rice came next. Fluffy, shiny grains, seasoned only with salt and a drizzle of oil. Then the collard greens, cut into thin strips like angel hair, quickly sautéed to maintain their dark green color and crunchy texture. The bacon bits were made with freshly toasted cassava flour, finely chopped bacon, and delicately scrambled eggs. As she cooked, Isabella couldn't stop thinking about the note. There was something in the vulnerability of those words that resonated with her own wounds. She too lived on memories of food. Afternoons in her grandmother's kitchen were practically the only happy memories of her childhood. The rest had been marked by her parents' fights, constant moves, and a permanent sense of instability. By 11:30, she began preparing dessert. A flan she had learned to make as a teenager. The burnt sugar syrup required perfect timing. Too little and it would lack color, too much and it would be bitter. She watched. The sugar slowly caramelize in the pan, stirring only when necessary until it reached the perfect amber hue. The phone vibrated. A message from Edward. "Isabella, I know it's last minute, but would it be possible to include sugar bread as well? My grandfather always served it on special occasions, and I think it would be a nice touch. I'll pay extra, of course." Sugar bread. Isabella smiled. It was a recipe she hadn't made in years, a simple yet labor-intensive sweet her grandmother prepared for the midsummer festival. Sugar, eggs, flour, and a lot of love, baked slowly, until forming a golden crust outside and remaining soft as cotton inside. "Of course, Mr. Edward, it will be ready on time," she replied, already separating the additional ingredients. By 12:15, everything was practically ready. The special meals, larger aluminum containers she had bought specifically for the occasion, were laid out on the table, each containing a generous portion of complete stew. The aroma filled the entire studio apartment, escaping through the window cracks and invading the hallway of the building. Mrs. Johnson knocked on the door. "Isa, do you need help carrying all this?" "No need. Rosa, the motorcycle can handle it." "I'm not talking about the motorcycle. I'm talking about you." The neighbor entered without ceremony, assessing the scene with... Isabella looked at him with experienced eyes. "You're 7 months pregnant and going to carry 15 pounds of food through Wall Street. That's not right." Isabella was about to protest, but Mrs. Johnson continued, "My grandson Junior is at home doing nothing useful. He'll go with you. Carry everything and come back. I won't take no for an answer." Junior was a 19-year-old boy, skinny as a matchstick but full of good intentions. In 15 minutes, he had helped Isabella pack everything carefully, organizing the meals in thermal boxes that kept the ideal temperature. The journey to Wall Street was made in contemplative silence. Isabella drove, thinking about the responsibility she carried. It wasn't just food, but the representation of an entire culinary culture for people who had probably never experienced authentic stew. Junior, on the back, held the boxes carefully as if transporting precious jewels. At the building, Mr. Thompson greeted them enthusiastically. "Wow, Isa! What a spread! Did Dr. Edward organize a party up there?" "Business meeting. Important people," she explained, rearranging the boxes on the cart that Mr. Thompson had provided. In the elevator, Isabella felt a different kind of anxiety than usual. It wasn't just the professional worry of delivering quality service, but something more personal. She wanted Edward to be proud of her choice, for the German investors to understand the cultural richness being offered. Edward was waiting for her at the office door, visibly nervous. He had swapped his formal suit for a light blue dress shirt without a tie, trying to create a more relaxed atmosphere. When he saw the amount of food, his eyes widened. "Isabella, this is amazing. The smell is already taking over the whole floor." "I hope they like it," she said, starting to organize everything on the meeting table. "The stew is just right, not too runny or too dry. The sugar bread is still warm." Edward approached, and for the first time, Isabella noticed a subtle fragrance. Not something expensive and artificial, but a clean scent of soap and discreet cologne. He watched each dish being uncovered with the reverence of someone witnessing a sacred ceremony. "Can I try?" he asked, almost whispering. Isabella served a small portion on a plate and watched Edward take his first bite. He closed his eyes, chewed slowly, and when he opened them again, there were tears in the corners. "It's exactly how my grandmother made it," he said, his voice choked. "Exactly." In that moment, Isabella understood that she had created something bigger than a business meal. She had recreated a bridge to Edward's most precious memories, returning to him a piece of childhood that seemed forever lost. "Thank you," he said, and there was so much weight in that word that Isabella felt her own chest tighten. "You're welcome, Mr. Edward. It's just food." "No." He shook his head slowly. "It's not just food. It's much more than that." 15 minutes later, the German investors began to arrive at Edward's office. Isabella watched discreetly from the elevator as she waited to go down, curious to see how they would react to the Brazilian food. There were 5 middle-aged men, impeccably dressed in dark suits, carrying laptops, and a seriousness that seemed etched on their faces. "Klaus, Hans, welcome," she heard Edward greeting them in fluent English. "I hope you're ready for an authentically Brazilian culinary experience." Isabella smiled to herself. There was something different in Edward's voice, a newfound confidence, as if the familiar food had given him the strength to face that crucial meeting. Back at her studio apartment, she found Junior helping Mrs. Johnson fold clothes on the hallway drying rack. The neighbor greeted her with an inquisitive look. "So, how did it go?" "It went well. He liked it a lot," Isabella replied, sitting heavily in the only chair in the apartment. Her back ached more than usual, and she felt her legs swollen inside her low-cut boots. "He just liked it," Mrs. Johnson insisted, with that maternal way of extracting information. "With the effort you put into that food, the man must have been moved." Isabella hesitated. How could she explain that she had seen Edward almost cry when tasting the stew? How to describe the intensity of that moment without sounding exaggerated or implying things that might not be true? "He really was moved," she finally admitted. "He said it was just like his grandmother's cooking." "Ah, there you go," Mrs. Johnson clapped her hands. "When a man talks about his grandmother's food, it's because it really touched his heart. You scored major points." "And there, my daughter, Mrs. Johnson, it's not like that, it's just work," Isabella protested, but without much conviction. "Just work? A man who pays extra, leaves sweet notes and asks for special food is interested in much more than a meal." Isabella's phone vibrated, interrupting the conversation. It was a message from Edward, sent at 3:30 in the afternoon. "Isabella, the meeting was an absolute success. The Germans were fascinated by the stew. They even asked for the recipe. Klaus said he had never eaten something so tasty and authentic. You saved me today, more than you can imagine. Thank you very much. Edward." Isabella reread the message 3 times before showing it to Mrs. Johnson, who nodded with satisfaction. "See, that man is in love." "With the food, Mrs. Johnson. With the food." "I know," Mrs. Johnson murmured, but her smile suggested she thought exactly the opposite. By late afternoon, while preparing the meals for the next day, Isabella couldn't stop thinking about Edward's expression when he tasted the stew. There was something deeply touching in the vulnerability of that man, who seemed to have everything under control, but completely disarmed in front of a dish that brought childhood. Memories. At 6 in the evening, the phone rang. It was an unknown number. "Hello? Isabella. This is Edward. Sorry for calling directly. I got your number from Mr. Thompson. I didn't want to bother you, but I need to talk to you." Isabella's heart raced. There was an urgency in his voice that put her on alert. "Is something wrong, Mr. Edward?" No, it's nothing bad. It's true, it's the opposite. The meeting went so well that the Germans want to close the deal, but there's one thing. They want to have dinner here in New York before heading back to Berlin, and they specifically asked to try more Brazilian dishes, prepared by the same person who made lunch. Isabella sat on the bed, processing the information. A dinner for German investors was far beyond her usual experience. It was too much responsibility, too much money, too much pressure. "How many people would there be?" she asked, buying time to think. 8, including me and my partner. It would be Friday night at my apartment. I know it's presumptuous of me, but would you be up for it? Mr. Edward, I've never cooked for a formal dinner. I'm not sure I have the experience for that." "Isabella," his voice lowered, more intense, "I've tasted your food. It's not just technique, it's a true love for what you do. That's exactly what I want to show them, that there are still people who cook with soul." Silence stretched for a few seconds. Isabella looked around the tiny studio, at the stacked pots and the 2-burner stove that barely managed daily meal prep. How could she prepare a sophisticated dinner under those conditions? Where would it be exactly? Does your apartment have a fully equipped kitchen? Yes, completely. Actually, Edward hesitated. I live in Chelsea, in a penthouse. The kitchen is large, with all the equipment. You could prepare everything there if you prefer. A penthouse in Chelsea. Isabella swallowed hard. She was stepping into a completely different world, where a mistake could have consequences she couldn't even imagine. How much are you thinking of paying? $5,000. Isabella nearly dropped the phone. $5,000 was more than she earned in 3 months of deliveries. It was enough money to pay 2 months' rent, buy baby supplies, maybe even have a private prenatal checkup. I need to think, she stammered. Of course, I completely understand, but Isabella, can I say one thing? Today, when I tasted your stew, I was reminded of who I was before I became this version of myself. I haven't felt that way in years. You have a rare gift, and it would be an honor to share that talent with people who can truly appreciate it. After Edward hung up, Isabella sat on the bed for a long time, staring at the phone. Mrs. Johnson appeared at the door, as if sensing that something important had happened. What's with that? In-face girl. Isabella told her everything, the invitation, the amount, the fears. Johnson listened in silence, nodding at specific moments, frowning at others. $5,000, Johnson repeated when Isabella finished. My daughter, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. But what if I mess it up? What if the food doesn't turn out well? What if they don't like it? What if it goes well? Johnson countered. What if it opens doors you didn't even know existed? Isa, you cook better than any fancy restaurant chef I've ever met. The difference is that you cook with love, and that's something no school can teach. But it's a lot of responsibility. You already have responsibility. You have a baby on the way, rent to pay, a life to build. This is your chance to build something bigger. Isabella placed her hand on her belly, feeling the baby move as if it were also weighing in on the decision. If I accept, will you help me? Johnson smiled, hugging her tightly. My daughter, I won't just help you. I'm going to be your partner in this venture. Let's show these Germans what real Brazilian food is. On Friday morning, Isabella woke up at 3:30 a.m. with her stomach in knots from nerves. She had spent the last 3 days meticulously planning the menu with Johnson, an appetizer of cod fritters and cheese pastries, a main course of grilled picanha, bacon bits, special vinaigrette and coconut rice, dessert of coconut custard and gourmet brigadeiros. It was a menu that represented different regions of Brazil, sophisticated yet accessible to European palates. Johnson arrived at 4 a.m. carrying 2 huge bags of ingredients they had bought the day before at Grand Central Market. Her experience in northeastern cuisine would be crucial for the cod fritters, which required a specific level of desalting and a particular frying technique. Good morning, my partner, Johnson said, already tying on her apron. Today is the big day. How are you feeling? Like I might faint at any moment, Isabella confessed, putting on the only formal outfit she owned, a long-sleeved black blouse and a pair of slacks that still fit, despite her 7-month belly. It's good nerves. When we stop feeling butterflies in our stomachs, it's because we've lost our passion for what we do. By 7 a.m., they were ready to go. Edward had sent the address. The day before, Pine Street, 1847, Penthouse 3. Isabella had looked it up on Google Maps and discovered it was in an upscale area, surrounded by expensive restaurants and art galleries. The motorcycle ride to Chelsea took 40 minutes, with Johnson on the back, holding 2 thermal boxes full of pre-prepared ingredients. The building was even more imposing than Isabella had imagined. 20 floors of tinted glass, a spacious lobby with marble, and a stunning view of the city. The doorman, a man in his 50s impeccably uniformed, greeted them with professional courtesy. You must be the cooks for Dr. Edward. He's expecting you. Penthouse 3, top floor. In the private elevator that went directly to the penthouse, Isabella felt her heart pounding so hard she was sure Johnson could hear it. When the doors opened directly into the apartment, she had to hold onto the wall to keep from stumbling. The penthouse was larger than the entire building where she lived. Double-height ceilings, floor-to-ceiling windows with a panoramic view of New York, designer furniture that looked like it came out of architecture magazines. But what caught her attention the most was the emotional emptiness of the place. Everything. Isabella was perfectly organized, but there was no personal touch, no photos, no objects indicating that someone truly lived there. Edward appeared from a side hallway wearing jeans and a navy polo shirt. It was the first time Isabella saw him outside the corporate environment, and he looked younger, less rigid, though he still carried that constant tension in his shoulders. "Isabella, Mrs. Johnson, welcome. I hope you found it easy," he said. "Edward, your home is—" Isabella began, but she couldn't finish the sentence. How to describe such wealth without sounding inappropriate? "Very beautiful," Mrs. Johnson diplomatically completed. "Where's the kitchen?" Edward guided them through the minimalist living room to a kitchen that made Isabella sigh with envy. It was 15 square meters of pure luxury, Carrara marble countertops, stainless steel appliances that looked professional, an island larger than her entire studio apartment, and a double oven that probably cost more than her annual salary at the factory. "Oh my," Mrs. Johnson murmured, reverently running her hand over the smooth surface of the countertop. "This is like something out of a cooking show." Edward smiled shyly. "To be honest, I've never used even half of these things. The kitchen came like this when I bought the apartment, fully equipped. I thought it would be a good investment, but you don't cook," Isabella completed. "Exactly. It's paradoxical, isn't it? I have the kitchen of my dreams and live off delivery." There was a melancholy in the confession that touched Isabella. While she dreamed of decent equipment to expand her business, Edward had all of this and didn't know what to do with such abundance. "Well," Mrs. Johnson said, always practical, "today this kitchen is going to work properly. Isabella, shall we start with the cod fritters?" The next 4 hours were a synchronized dance between the two women. Mrs. Johnson handled the cod fritters with the precision of someone who had made thousands of them, while Isabella focused on the ribeye, seasoning it that she had marinated since the day before. Edward stayed nearby, sometimes offering help, sometimes simply watching the process with genuine fascination. "Can I ask how you learned all this?" he said, watching Mrs. Johnson shape the fritters with fluid and precise movements. "Need and tradition," Mrs. Johnson replied. "My mother cooked for others in Miami. I grew up in the kitchen helping. Then I came to New York in the 80s and worked for a wealthy family for 20 years. I learned refinements, but my heart has always been Southern." "And you, Isabella?" "Survival," she said, seasoning the ribeye with coarse salt. "When you don't have money to eat out, you learn to make everything at home. My grandmother used to say that cooking is the most democratic art in the world. Anyone can learn. You just need patience and love." Edward nodded thoughtfully. "My ex-wife hated cooking. She said it was a waste of time, that there were people paid to do it. I never understood why, but now, seeing you both work, there's something almost meditative in the process." The mention of his ex-wife made Isabella look up from the meat. It was the first time Edward spoke about his personal life beyond memories of his grandmother. "Do you have children?" Mrs. Johnson asked with the naturalness of someone who had already built enough intimacy for such questions. Edward hesitated for a moment. "I have a daughter, Sophie. She's 15 and lives in London with her mother." "London?" Isabella couldn't hide her surprise. "My ex-wife is English. When we divorced 3 years ago, she decided to go back there. She took Sophie with her." There was a deep pain in those words, a barely healed wound that Edward tried to hide behind objective facts. "And you didn't go with them?" Mrs. Johnson asked gently. "My life was here. The company, the commitments, I thought it would be temporary, that they would return in a few months." "But they didn't return," Isabella completed. "No. Sophie adapted well to the private school, made friends. Kate, my ex-wife, said it would be selfish of me to uproot her just because I missed her." The silence that followed was filled only with the sounds of the kitchen, the frying of the fritters, the sizzling of the meat on the grill, the soft noise of the spoon stirring the coconut rice. In that moment, Isabella understood where the loneliness she perceived in Edward came from. He was not just a single executive living a privileged life. He was a father, separated from his daughter, a man who had chosen work over family, and now bore the consequences of that decision. "Does she come back to visit?" Isabella asked softly. "During school holidays, but with each visit I feel like we're more distant. She's grown so much in these 3 years. Sometimes I feel like a stranger in my own daughter's life." Mrs. Johnson stopped stirring the fritters and turned to Edward. "Son, can I give you a motherly piece of advice? Physical distance doesn't mean emotional distance unless you allow it. That girl needs to know she has a father who cares, even if he's far away." "That's what I try to do. I send messages, I make video calls." "That's not what I'm talking about," Mrs. Johnson gently interrupted him. "I'm talking about showing who you really are, not just being the provider father. Show your vulnerabilities, your memories, your passions, like the story of your grandmother's stew." Edward fell silent, absorbing Mrs. Johnson's words. Isabella watched the interaction with admiration for her neighbor's natural wisdom, her ability to touch the core of problems with simplicity and care. "You both are right," he finally said. "I think I'm afraid of not being interesting enough for a teenager. My life is too predictable." "Everyone is interesting," Isabella said, seasoning the vinaigrette. "You just need to find the right way to tell your story." By 6 in the evening, Edward's penthouse had transformed. The aroma of Brazilian food lingered in the air like a warm invitation, contrasting with the coldness of the minimalist furniture. The dining table, which usually looked like a museum piece, was now set with elegant dishes, discreet flowers, and candles that created a cozy atmosphere. Isabella looked at herself in the bathroom mirror, trying to disguise the nervousness. The black blouse did what it could to hide her 7-month belly, but she still felt out of place in that luxurious environment. Mrs. Johnson appeared behind her, adjusting her grey hair that she had styled into an elegant bun. "You look beautiful, dear, and more importantly, the food is perfect." "Rosa, what if they don't like it? What if it's too simple for their taste?" "Isabella Smith." Mrs. Johnson turned her to face her directly. "You made the best food I've ever tasted today. These Germans are going to fall in love with our culture. Trust me." The intercom buzzed at exactly 7 o'clock. Edward, who had changed into a light blue dress shirt without a tie, looked as nervous as they did. "They've arrived," he announced. "Isabella, Mrs. Johnson, do you want to stay in the kitchen, or would you prefer I introduce you to the guests?" Isabella hesitated. In every home where they had cooked for special events, they always remained discreetly in the kitchen, invisible to the eyes of the hosts. But there was something in Edward's proposal that suggested a different treatment. "If you don't mind, we would like to meet the people we are cooking for," Mrs. Johnson said with dignity. Edward smiled, the first genuinely relaxed smile Isabella had seen on him all day. It would be an honor. The German investors entered in a group, 5 men in their 40s to 50s, conversing in fluent English mixed with German words. Klaus Müller, who seemed to be the leader of the group, was tall and thin, with greying blonde hair and thin-framed glasses. Hans Weber, shorter and stockier, had a constant smile that conveyed genuine friendliness. The other three, Friedrich, Matthias, and Jürgen, maintained typical corporate postures, but showed evident curiosity about the apartment and the aromas coming from the kitchen. "Gentlemen," Edward said in English, "I would like to introduce you to the ones responsible for what you're going to experience tonight. Isabella Smith and Mrs. Johnson, the true artists behind this culinary experience." Klaus stepped forward, extending his hand to Mrs. Johnson first, then to Isabella. "It's a pleasure to meet you. Wednesday's lunch was exceptional. We are looking forward to tonight." Isabella was surprised by Klaus's fluency in Portuguese, albeit with a German accent. Mrs. Johnson, always at ease with people, smiled warmly. "I hope you enjoy our cuisine. We prepared it with great care." "May I ask," Hans interjected in English, which Edward translated simultaneously, "what is the philosophy behind the dishes you prepared?" Isabella looked at Mrs. Johnson, who nodded encouragingly. "Well," she began in Portuguese, with Edward translating, "each dish tells a story from our country. The cod fritters bring Portuguese influence. The ribeye represents the south, land of the Pampas. The coconut rice is from the northeast, where Mrs. Johnson was born. And the coconut custard is pure Brazilian saudade." Klaus discreetly jotted something down in a small notebook. Saudade. This word doesn't have an exact translation in German, does it? "Exactly," Edward replied. "It's a typically Brazilian emotion, a mix of nostalgia, love, and melancholy." "And can it be food?" Friedrich asked with genuine curiosity. "It can," Mrs. Johnson replied with a smile. "Every meal made with love carries saudade for something." The initial conversation broke the formality that typically characterized business dinners. The Germans showed genuine interest in Brazilian culinary culture, asking questions about ingredients, techniques, and regional traditions. When they sat at the table, Isabella and Mrs. Johnson served the warm cod fritters, accompanied by a sweet and sour biquinho pepper that Mrs. Johnson had prepared especially. The first taste was followed by contemplative silence, then murmurs of approval. "This is extraordinary," Klaus said, slowly tasting a second fritter. "The texture is perfect, and the flavor. It's familiar and exotic at the same time." Hans closed his eyes while chewing. "It reminds me of my grandmother's potato pastries, but with something completely different." "It's the Brazilian soul," Edward explained. "Isabella has the gift of putting emotion into food." During the main course, the perfectly grilled ribeye, accompanied by crispy bacon bits, creamy coconut rice, and refreshing vinaigrette, the conversation flowed naturally between business and culture. Isabella and Mrs. Johnson took turns serving and participating in discussions, treated not as employees, but as an integral part of the experience. "Isabella," Klaus addressed her directly, "Edward told us you have a meal prep business. How did you start this venture?" Isabella felt all eyes turned to her. For a moment she hesitated, how to tell her story of unemployment and necessity to men who clearly had never faced financial hardships. "Out of necessity," she replied honestly. "I was laid off from the factory where I worked 8 years ago, found out I was pregnant, and needed to find a way to survive. Cooking was what I did best." "And you turned necessity into opportunity," Hans commented admiringly. "That's true entrepreneurship." "More than that," Edward added, "she turned survival into art. Every meal she delivers carries the same care you are experiencing today." Matthias, who had been quiet for most of the dinner, leaned forward. "May I ask a personal question? What is it like working while pregnant, building a business from scratch?" The question caught Isabella off guard with its honesty. "It's scary," she admitted. "Every day I wake up wondering if I'll make it, if the food will be good, if the clients will keep ordering. But it's also liberating. I depend only on myself. And the baby that's coming, The baby gives me strength to keep going. I want him to grow up seeing that his mother didn't give up, even when everything seemed impossible." Klaus exchanged meaningful glances with the other Germans. "Edward," he said, "you mentioned you are looking for investors for social impact projects here in the United States. What kind of projects?" Edward hesitated for a moment, as if reformulating a presentation he had rehearsed. "Projects that empower people like Isabella and Mrs. Johnson. Micro-entrepreneurs who have talent and determination but lack access to capital or infrastructure to grow." "Are you thinking of something specific?" "I was thinking of incubators for—" Isabella was surprised to hear Edward discussing the culinary incubator project. "Interesting," murmured Charles. "Very interesting." When dessert time arrived, golden coconut custards resembling little suns and artisanal chocolate truffles that Mrs. Johnson insisted on buying, the atmosphere was completely relaxed. The Germans were animatedly sharing their experiences with Brazilian food, recounting travel stories and culinary discoveries. "This was," declared Charles while tasting the coconut custard, "one of the most authentic dining experiences I've ever had, not just because of the quality of the food, but because of the story behind it." "I agree," said Henry. "You managed to capture the essence of an entire country in one meal." Edward looked at Isabella with an expression she couldn't fully decipher. There was pride there, but also something deeper, a gratitude that went beyond the professional success of the night. When the Germans began to say their goodbyes at 11 o'clock, Charles pulled Edward aside for a private conversation on the terrace. Isabella and Mrs. Johnson were tidying up the kitchen, but couldn't help but notice the intensity of the discussion outside. "I wonder what they're talking about," Mrs. Johnson murmured. "Business, for sure," Isabella replied, but her heart raced with a premonition that something fundamental had changed in her life that night. After the Germans left, a strange silence enveloped the apartment. Edward stood on the terrace for long minutes, contemplating the illuminated city below. While Isabella and Mrs. Johnson finished organizing the kitchen, the contrast between the night's excitement and the current stillness was almost palpable. "Mr. Edward," Isabella called softly from the terrace door. "Is everything okay?" He turned, and she noticed a different tension on his face, not nervousness, but a contemplative intensity, as if he were processing important information. "Everything is perfect," he replied, returning to the living room. "Better than perfect, actually. You were extraordinary today." Mrs. Johnson, always straightforward, dried her hands on a dish towel and approached. "What did the German discuss with you out there? By the look on your face, it was something important." Edward smiled at the frankness of the question. "It was indeed very important." He sat down on the sofa, gesturing for them to take seats in the nearby armchairs. "Charles and the others were so impressed that they want to invest in the culinary incubator project I mentioned during dinner." "What project?" Isabella asked, though she suspected the answer. "The culinary incubator project. Equipped spaces where food entrepreneurs can develop their businesses with proper structure, mentorship, and access to larger markets." Mrs. Johnson nodded slowly. "And what does that have to do with us?" Edward hesitated, as if carefully choosing his words. "They want Isabella to be the pilot project." The silence that followed was deafening. Isabella felt as if the ground had vanished beneath her feet. "What do you mean, pilot project?" "They want to invest in creating the first space, using your business as a model. You would still own the company, but you would have access to a professional kitchen, top-notch equipment, help with certifications, marketing, expansion." "And what would be the catch?" Mrs. Johnson asked, with the natural suspicion of someone who grew up learning that nothing in life is free. "They would take 20% of the profits for the next 5 years. After that, you would have full control." Isabella ran her hand over her belly, feeling the baby move as if reacting to the tension. It was an opportunity beyond her wildest dreams, but there was something about the proposal that made her uncomfortable. "Why me?" she asked. "They didn't even know me before today." Edward leaned forward. "Because you represent exactly what they want to support. Genuine talent, determination, quality products created under adverse conditions. You are living proof that entrepreneurship is not about initial capital, but about passion and competence." "And what about you?" Isabella looked him directly in the eye. "What would your role be in all this?" The question caught Edward off guard. He looked away for a moment before responding. "I would be the local manager of the project, responsible for implementing the structure, bridging the gap between you entrepreneurs and the German investors." "You entrepreneurs," Mrs. Johnson repeated. "So it wouldn't just be Isabella?" "No. The idea is to start with her, learn from the process, and then expand to other food businesses, create a network of incubators throughout the city." Isabella stood up and walked to the window, observing the night view of New York. The city lights stretched to the horizon, each point representing dreams, struggles, entire lives being built. She thought of her small apartment in Brooklyn, the cold mornings waking up at 4 a.m., the constant uncertainty about the future. "Can I ask an honest question?" she said without turning around. "Of course." "None of this would have happened if I were a 50-year-old man selling meal prep, would it?" Edward took a few seconds to respond. "Probably not." "So part of their interest is in the symbolism. The young pregnant woman from a low-income background who succeeded in life through sheer will." "Isabella," Edward began, but she interrupted him. "I'm not criticizing. I'm trying to understand the reality of the situation." She turned to face him. "They want an inspiring story to sell alongside the project, don't they?" Mrs. Johnson shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Isa, maybe you're being too harsh." "No, Mrs. Johnson, she's right," Edward admitted. "Yes, part of the interest is in the human aspect of the story. But does that diminish the value of your talent? Does it diminish the quality of your food? Does it diminish the impact this project could have on your life?" Isabella sat back down, feeling the weight of the decision. "And what if I don't want to be anyone's inspiring story? What if I just want to continue making my food my way?" "Then you have every right to refuse," Edward said simply. "But can I ask you a question? Why do you cook?" "To survive." "No, Isabella, you could have found any job to survive. You could make basic meal prep, without special seasoning, without love. Why do you put so much love into what you do?" The question touched on something deep that Isabella preferred not to examine too closely. Because it's the only thing I know how to do right. The only thing that makes me feel like I have value. And how many people do you think feel the same way? How many Isabellas are out there, cooking in tiny apartments, dreaming of an opportunity? Mrs. Johnson nodded slowly. "He has a point, girl." "I'm not asking for an answer now," Edward continued. "It's too big of a decision. But think about this. It's not about being a symbol for anyone. It's about creating a path that others can follow." Isabella looked at her own hands, calloused from work, with small knife cuts, short and practical nails. They were hands that knew the weight of heavy pots, the right texture of spices, the exact timing of each preparation. "How much time do I have to decide?" 2 weeks. They are going back to Germany tomorrow, but Charles will return at the end of the month for a definitive answer. And if I accept, when would I start? Immediately. They want the first space up and running in 3 months. 3 months, Isabella repeated. The baby is due in 2. The reality of the situation hit her like a cold wave. She would be taking on a massive business commitment with a newborn in her arms. How could she balance motherhood with the pressure of being the pilot project for international investors? "Mr. Edward," Mrs. Johnson said with her natural diplomacy, "could you give us a few minutes to talk alone?" Edward nodded, standing up. "Of course, I'll make some coffee. Whenever you're ready." After he disappeared into the kitchen, Mrs. Johnson approached Isabella. "Talk to me, daughter. What's going through your mind?" "Fear, Mrs. Johnson. Fear of not being able to do it. Fear of accepting and failing. Fear of becoming a laughingstock. Look at the girl who thought she could become a businesswoman. And fear of refusing and spending the rest of your life wondering, what if?" Isabella nodded, feeling her eyes well up. "Also, want to know what I think?" "I do. I think you've already made your decision. You're just afraid to admit it." The following Monday, Isabella woke up with a different feeling. It wasn't just the physical weight of advanced pregnancy, but a mental restlessness that had been haunting her since dinner at Edward's penthouse. She had spent the entire weekend mulling over the German's proposal, analyzing every aspect, every risk, every possibility. Mrs. Johnson appeared at the door of the small apartment at 6 in the morning, as had become customary since they became partners in the culinary venture. "Good morning, thinker," she said, immediately noticing Isabella's worried expression. "Did you sleep poorly again?" "I couldn't sleep properly," Isabella confessed, mechanically stirring the beans in the pot. "It keeps spinning in my head. What if I accept and everything goes wrong? What if I can't handle the pressure? And what if everything goes right?" Mrs. Johnson countered, starting to peel the hard-boiled eggs for the meal prep. "Have you thought about that possibility?" "Mrs. Johnson, there's a lot of money involved, a lot of responsibility. They will expect results, numbers, growth. I don't even know how a real business works." "Girl, you already have a real business. 40 meal preps a day, regular customers, guaranteed income. The only difference is the size." Isabella's phone vibrated. It was a message from Edward. "Good morning, Isabella. I know you're thinking about the proposal. No pressure, but I'd like to talk when you're ready. I have some information that might help with your decision." Isabella showed the message to Mrs. Johnson, who read it carefully. "He's anxious," Mrs. Johnson commented. "I bet it's important for him that you accept too." "Why do you think that?" "Because this project could be his chance to do something that really matters, instead of just moving money around." Mrs. Johnson's observation made Isabella reflect on something she hadn't considered before. Edward was also at a professional crossroads, seeking to find meaning in a career that, despite financial success, seemed to bring him no personal satisfaction. At 9 in the morning, after delivering the morning meal preps, Isabella decided to call Edward. "Edward, it's Isabella. You said you wanted to talk?" "Yes. Thank you for calling. You can come to my office, or would you prefer I come to your place?" Isabella hesitated. The idea of having Edward over at her small apartment embarrassed her. It was a stark contrast to the luxurious penthouse where they had been on Friday. "I can come there. What time would be good?" "Whenever you want. I cancelled all my morning meetings." An hour later, Isabella was back in the office on the 23rd floor, but this time the dynamic was completely different. Edward had prepared coffee and laid out some papers on the conference table. There was a professional seriousness in the air, but also a palpable anxiety. "Isabella, thank you for coming. First, I want to make it clear that regardless of your decision about the project, our business relationship remains the same. You shouldn't feel pressured." "Thank you for saying that." Isabella sat down, placing her bag on her lap like a protective shield. "But I have some questions. All the questions you want. First, if I accept, what exactly would my role be? Would I continue cooking or become, I don't know, an executive?" Edward smiled. "You would continue doing exactly what you already do. Cooking. The difference is that you would have a team to help with the operational side. Purchasing, deliveries, customer service, administrative tasks. Second question, what if I want to leave the project halfway through? There is an exit clause. After a year, you can choose to leave, keeping the equipment and the structure as compensation for the time invested. Isabella nodded, feeling slightly more secure. Third question, why are you doing this? What is your real interest in this story? Edward remained silent for a long moment, as if he were organizing complex thoughts. Can I be completely honest? Please. For the last 3 years, since the divorce, my life has been reduced to working to earn money I don't need, on projects that don't excite me, for people who don't really know me. He paused, looking out the window. When I tasted your stew for the first time, I remembered who I was before I became this version of myself. You gave me back something I thought I had lost forever. What? The ability to be moved by something simple and true. My grandmother's food was not just food, it was love, materialized. And that's what you do. That's what I want to help preserve and expand. Edward's words touched something deep in Isabella's heart. There was a genuine vulnerability in his confession that made her lower her defenses. Edward, she said softly, can I ask a personal question? Of course. Are you doing this for me or for yourself? The question caught Edward off guard. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it, clearly reflecting on the complexity of the question. For both, he finally admitted. I genuinely believe in your talent and the impact this project can have. But I also have to admit that working with you has given me a sense of purpose that I haven't felt in years. And your daughter, how does she fit into all of this? Edward sighed deeply. Sophie is coming to visit me next week. She'll be here for 2 weeks during the mid-year break. And for the first time in a long time, I'll be able to show her something I'm truly proud of. Not just numbers on spreadsheets or successful mergers, but a project that helps real people. Isabella felt a pang of unexpected emotion. The idea that her decision could impact the relationship between Edward and his daughter added a layer of responsibility she hadn't anticipated. Can I see the financial details? The real numbers? Edward opened a folder and spread detailed spreadsheets across the table. The initial investment would be $500,000 to equip the space, hire staff, and have working capital for the first 6 months. The projection is that you will triple the current revenue in a year. Isabella swallowed hard. $500,000. It was more money than she could save in 20 whole lifetimes. And what if it doesn't work out? If I can't meet the goals? The goals are progressive and realistic. Charles and the others are not dreamers. They are experienced investors. They would only bet on something they genuinely believe will work. Isabella studied the numbers, trying to process the magnitude of what was being offered. It was a chance to completely transform her life and that of the baby she was expecting. But it was also a leap into the unknown that could result in public failure and unpayable doubts. Can I take these papers to show Mrs. Johnson? Of course. And Isabella, can I suggest something? What? Before making the final decision, how about we visit some culinary spaces in the city so you can see how they operate, meet other entrepreneurs who have gone through similar processes? The suggestion made sense. Isabella realized that her resistance was partly due to fear of the unknown. Seeing real examples of success could help her visualize her own journey. That would be good, she agreed. When can we go? Tomorrow, if you want. I know some interesting places. When Isabella left the office, carrying the folder with the financial information, she felt as if she were carrying her own future in her hands. The decision she would make in the coming weeks would not only affect her life, but also that of Mrs. Johnson, Edward, and the baby growing in her womb. On her way home, she stopped in front of a baby store window and looked at the tiny shoes, delicate outfits, and white cribs. For the first time, she allowed herself to dream not just of survival, but of prosperity, of the possibility of offering her child a life full of opportunities she had never had. "What do you think, little one?" she whispered, placing her hand on her belly. "Should Mommy risk it all?" In response, the baby kicked hard, as if saying, "Let's go. I'm for it." On Tuesday, Edward arrived at Isabella's small apartment promptly at 9 in the morning, driving a discreet silver sedan that contrasted with the simplicity of the neighborhood. Isabella watched him from the window as he parked, noticing how he seemed slightly out of place among the popular cars and motorcycles parked on the street. "Mrs. Johnson, he's here," she announced, checking her reflection one last time. She had chosen her best outfit, a navy blue blouse and dress pants that still fit, even with her nearly 8-month belly. "Take it easy, girl," Mrs. Johnson advised her, fixing her own hair. "Today is about learning, not deciding." Edward climbed the 3 flights of stairs to the apartment, and Isabella noticed he arrived slightly out of breath. The contrast between his sedentary life and the physical reality of the walk-up building was evident. "Good morning, ladies," he greeted with a genuine smile. "Ready for our culinary excursion?" The first destination was the Grand Central Market, but not to buy ingredients. Edward wanted to show Isabella the small restaurants and snack bars that operated within the historic complex. "Look at that stall over there," he pointed to a small space where a Japanese woman in her 60s was preparing temaki with impressive agility. Mrs. Yuki started selling food on the street 15 years ago. Today she has 3 employees and serves over 200 customers a day. Isabella observed the constant movement, the efficient organization of the tiny space, the line of customers waiting patiently. How did she manage to grow like that? "Consistency, quality, and word of mouth," Edward explained. "The same foundation you already have." They approached the counter, and Edward greeted Mrs. Yuki with a warm smile. Mrs. Yuki smiled warmly, wiping her hands on her apron before shaking Isabella's hand. "Edward, I would like to introduce Isabella, a food entrepreneur," he said. "Oh, how wonderful!" Mrs. Yuki exclaimed with a heavy accent, but her English was fluent. "What type of food do you work with?" "Homemade Brazilian food, meal prep," Isabella replied shyly. "Great! Homemade food always has a market. The secret is not to lose the love for cooking, even when it becomes a big business." The conversation with Mrs. Yuki lasted 20 minutes, during which she shared stories about the tough early years, sleepless nights, and moments when she wanted to give up. But she also spoke about the satisfaction of seeing customers who had been coming for years, about employees who became like family, and about the feeling of building something lasting. "At first, I was afraid of growing," she confessed. "I thought, what if I lose quality? What if I can't control everything? But I learned that growing doesn't mean losing control. It means sharing responsibility with people who believe in your dream." The next stop was the Santa Lucia Emporium, a gourmet space in Brooklyn where small producers sold their products. Edward guided Isabella through the aisles, showcasing everything, from artisanal chocolates to homemade preserves, each product telling a story of family entrepreneurship. "This place functions as an informal incubator," Edward explained. "Producers pay a monthly fee for the space, but they have access to a clientele that values artisanal products and is willing to pay fair prices." They stopped at Mary's stand, a 50-year-old woman selling traditional Southern sweets. Her space was small but impeccably organized, with jars full of caramel, guava paste, and peanut brittle that looked like edible jewels. "How did you start here?" Isabella asked, genuinely curious. My husband lost his job 5 years ago, Mary explained while arranging the sweets in the display. I always made sweets for the family, and a friend suggested I try selling them. I started at home, then at a fair, and 2 years ago I got this space here. And now? Now I have a steady income, my own schedule, and my 15-year-old son helps me on weekends. He's learning management by observing the business. During the drive to the next location, Isabella remained silent, absorbing the stories she had heard. Edward respected her contemplation, driving calmly through the streets of New York that were beginning to show the midday hustle. What are you thinking? He asked when they stopped at a traffic light. That all these people overcame the same fear I'm feeling, she replied honestly, and that they all talk about growing as something natural, not as an impossible leap. Because for them it was natural. Growth happens step by step, not all at once. The last destination of the morning was the most impressive to Isabella. A shared kitchen in Williamsburg where 15 small food businesses shared professional equipment, cold storage, and production space. The space functioned as a laboratory for culinary ideas where entrepreneurs tested recipes, developed products, and shared experiences. Daniel, the space manager, welcomed them enthusiastically. He was a 40-year-old chef who had left traditional restaurants to support small businesses. The idea here is to democratize access to professional equipment, he explained, showcasing industrial ovens, giant mixers, and a packaging area with health certification. Many entrepreneurs have talent and amazing recipes, but they lack the structure to grow. How does the division system work? Isabella asked, observing 3 people working simultaneously on different projects. Each entrepreneur pays a monthly fee based on usage. There are reserved hours, but when someone doesn't show up, others can use the space. Everyone helps everyone. Edward and Daniel exchanged meaningful glances, and Isabella realized that this visit was not casual. They were showing her a functional model of what could be created with German investment. Can I ask? Isabella addressed a young woman preparing artisanal breads at a nearby counter. What is it like to work here? The young woman, who introduced herself as Claire, paused from kneading the dough for a moment. Liberating, she replied without hesitation. I work 40 hours a week producing my breads, and the rest of the time is mine. I earn 3 times what I made as a bakery employee, and I have full control over the quality. And you're not afraid it might go wrong? Claire laughed. Of course I am. Every day I wake up afraid that no one will buy my breads, but I also wake up excited because I know I'm building something of my own. During lunch, at a small restaurant nearby, Edward finally asked the question Isabella knew was coming. What did you think of everything you saw today? Isabella chewed slowly on her sandwich, organizing her thoughts. I found it inspiring and scary and possible. Possible, yes. Until this morning, the German project seemed like an impossible dream, something too big for someone like me. But seeing these people, they are like me. They started small, with fear, without guarantees. And now? Now I'm starting to believe that maybe I can really do it. Edward smiled, but not triumphantly, with genuine relief. Isabella, can I confess something? I was more nervous than you about these visits. Why? Because if you decided you didn't want to accept the proposal, I wouldn't know how to convince the Germans that it's worth investing in other similar projects in the United States. You are my proof of concept. The honesty of the confession touched Isabella. Edward wasn't just offering an opportunity. He was betting his own professional credibility on her ability to make the project succeed. That means you really believe in me, she said, more as a statement than a question. I do. More than you believe in yourself. On the way back home, Isabella felt that something fundamental had changed in her perspective. The fear was still there, but now it was accompanied by something stronger, real and tangible hope that she could. Isabella was determined to build a better future for herself and the child she was about to have. "Mrs. Johnson," she said as soon as they arrived at the small apartment, "I think I'm going to accept the offer." Mrs. Johnson, who was peeling potatoes for dinner, dropped the knife and hugged Isabella tightly. "It's about time, girl. It's about time." 2 weeks later, Isabella was sitting in the conference room of Edward's office, signing contracts that would change her life forever. Charles had returned from Germany as promised, accompanied by a Brazilian lawyer who explained each clause in detail. Mrs. Johnson was by her side, dressed in her best outfit and holding Isabella's hand during the most tense moments. "Congratulations, Isabella," Charles said after the last signature was made. "We are very excited to start this journey together. You will be our ambassador of authentic Brazilian cuisine." Isabella smiled, but her hands trembled slightly. She had just become a partner in a project worth $500,000, something that 6 months ago would have been unthinkable. The baby, as if sensing the importance of the moment, kicked strongly, making everyone laugh. "I think he approves of the decision," Edward commented, watching Isabella's belly move. "Or she," Mrs. Johnson added. "It could be an entrepreneurial girl." The chosen location for the first culinary space was a renovated warehouse in Williamsburg, 15 minutes away from the shared kitchen they had visited. During the 2 weeks between the decision and the contract signing, Edward had worked tirelessly to structure the project. Equipment ordered, initial team hired, health certifications in progress. "Can we visit the space now?" Isabella asked, curious to see where her new professional life would begin. "Of course. It's our first official stop as partners," Edward replied, already organizing. The papers. The warehouse was under construction, but it was already possible to visualize how it would look when completed. 200 square meters divided into production area, storage, packaging, and a small dining area where customers could taste the dishes before placing orders. The walls were being painted a soft yellow reminiscent of corn, and large windows ensured abundant natural light. "That will be your main station," Edward pointed to a space where a professional 8-burner stove would be installed. "And that area will be for Mrs. Johnson, specializing in sweets and savory dishes from the Northeast." Mrs. Johnson's eyes widened. "My area? Of course, you've been part of the team from the beginning. We couldn't imagine the project without you." Isabella felt a wave of emotion seeing the genuine happiness on Mrs. Johnson's face. Throughout her life, the neighbor had cooked for other families, taken care of other homes, worked for the dreams of others. Now, at 68, she would finally have her own space where her culinary gifts would be recognized and valued. "Charles," Isabella addressed the German investor, "can I ask a question about the future?" "Naturally. If this project succeeds, how many similar spaces do you plan to open?" "Our goal is to have 10 units operating in New York over the next 3 years, each one specializing in a type of regional Brazilian cuisine, northeastern, southern, gaucho, Amazonian." The magnitude of the vision left Isabella impressed. They were not just investing in her small business, they were betting on the creation of a network that could revolutionize culinary entrepreneurship in the city. "And after New York?" she asked. "Miami, Charleston, Washington, D.C. Brazilian cuisine has the potential to be recognized internationally as a unique cultural heritage. You will be the pioneers of this mission. Unique cultural heritage." Isabella had never thought of her food in such grand terms. To her, it had always been just a way to survive, to put food on the table and pay the bills. But perhaps Edward and Charles were right. Perhaps there was something bigger in what they were doing, something that went beyond mere economic necessity. Later in the afternoon, when they returned to Edward's office to finalize the last bureaucratic details, Isabella received an unexpected call. It was Dr. Henry, her obstetrician, with an urgency in his voice that immediately put her on alert. "Isabella, I need you to come to the hospital now. Your latest tests showed some irregularities that we need to investigate." Isabella's blood ran cold. "What kind of irregularities, doctor?" "We prefer to discuss it in person. Can you come now?" Edward, who had noticed the tension in the conversation, immediately offered to take her to the hospital. Mrs. Johnson insisted on accompanying them, and within 20 minutes, the three were in Dr. Henry's office, waiting for the diagnosis with growing anxiety. "Isabella," the doctor began with his usual professional seriousness, "your tests indicate that you may go into premature labor at any moment. The baby is fine, but we need to monitor you closely." "Is that dangerous?" Mrs. Johnson asked, holding Isabella's hand. "At 8 months, it's not critical, but we need special care. Isabella, you will need to drastically reduce your physical activities over the next few days." The impact of the news was immediate. How could she start a massive business project if she might need to stop everything at any moment to give birth? How could she honor her commitments to the German investors while on medical leave? Edward, sensing Isabella's internal conflict, leaned forward. "Doctor, how long of a rest would she need?" "Until the baby is born, and then at least 6 weeks of recovery." 2 months, Edward murmured, mentally calculating. "Charles is going back to Germany next week." "Edward," Isabella said with a choked voice, "I think I'm going to have to withdraw from the project. I can't commit to something this big knowing I won't be able to fulfill it." "No!" Mrs. Johnson exclaimed vehemently. "We're not giving up now. We'll find a way." "Mrs. Johnson, how? I can't stand and cook for 8 hours straight if I'm at risk of premature labor." Edward was silent for a few minutes, clearly processing information and possibilities. When he spoke again, there was a new determination in his voice. "Isabella, what if we temporarily change the schedule? What if, instead of you starting to cook immediately, you began by supervising while Mrs. Johnson and a hired team?" "How will you execute your recipes?" "What do you mean?" "You could train a team of cooks over the next few weeks, pass on your recipes, your seasoning secrets. Then even while resting, you could supervise remotely through video calls, taste dishes, give guidance." The proposal was creative, but Isabella had doubts. "But the quality? How can I ensure the food will be the same if I'm not physically present?" "Starting small," Edward explained. "In the first few weeks, just meal prep for delivery, exactly like you already do. Mrs. Johnson supervises production following your instructions, and you approve each dish before it goes out for delivery." Dr. Henry, who had been following the conversation with interest, interjected, "Medically speaking, supervising while seated would be perfectly possible. The important thing is to avoid prolonged physical effort and excessive stress." Mrs. Johnson nodded enthusiastically. "I can be Isabella's hands during these weeks. I know all her recipes. I just need guidance on the details." Charles, who had remained silent during the entire medical conversation, finally spoke. "In Germany, we have a saying, 'A well-managed crisis can become an opportunity.' Perhaps this obstacle will force us to create an even more innovative business model." "What do you mean?" Edward asked. "If Isabella can maintain the quality of her food through remote supervision and team training, we prove that culinary knowledge can be systematized and replicated without losing its soul. This would make the model much more scalable to other cities." It was a perspective none of them had considered. What initially seemed like an insurmountable obstacle could in fact become the key to even more ambitious growth. "Isabella," Edward said gently, "the decision is yours. We can postpone the project, modify it, or you can feel free to withdraw without any penalty. But know that we believe you can do it, even with these necessary adaptations." Isabella looked around the room. Dr. Henry waiting for her medical response, Mrs. Johnson holding her hand with silent encouragement, Edward and Charles representing a professional future that felt both near and distant. She placed her hand on her belly, feeling the baby move gently, as if saying everything would be all right. "Let's try," she finally said. "We'll adapt, improvise, and make it work our way." Mrs. Johnson hugged Isabella tightly, whispering in her ear, "I always knew you were brave, my daughter. Now the whole world will know too." 3 days later, Michael Smith was born at 2 in the morning in a public hospital in Brooklyn. Edward and Mrs. Johnson were in the waiting room when the doctor announced that mother and baby were doing well. Isabella's first business had just gained its youngest member and its most powerful motivation to grow and thrive. 6 months later, Heart's Pot was serving 200 customers a day, employing 12 people, and had a waiting list to try the food that a young single mother prepared with love in partnership with a wise Southern lady and an executive who had rediscovered the meaning of professional purpose. Isabella's story had become much more than a survival strategy. It had transformed into a recipe for turning necessity into opportunity, fear into courage, and small dreams into realities that nourish not just bodies, but also souls.